Can't believe it's been 5 years since this institute launched, so this is a treat. We're going to do something a little different this morning. I'm not going to give a lecture. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint or keynote slide to give a talk. You'll hear some great lectures of that later. But I brought something with me I affectionately call my atheist glasses. Now, there's nothing really about the glasses per se, but what happens is when these glasses go on this morning, my worldview is going to transform from Christian professor at Biola University, which I guess you could say is the Oklahoma Wesleyan of the West Coast. And then I'm going to become an atheist and invite whatever questions or challenges you would like to raise. And then at the end, I'll take the glasses off and we'll say, all right, what did we learn? What just happened? All right, you guys ready for this? All right, 3 of you are ready for this. So let me lay a couple ground rules as we start off to this. First off, if somebody comes in late, can you please let him or her know what we are doing? So I teach it at Biola. President Piper mentioned I went there, and we would have chapels, and in our gym, we'd maybe have 2,000 or 3,000 students in a chapel. And there was one chapel in particular, you'd have enjoyed this, Abdu. We had a missionary to Muslims come and give a presentation. He started off, he said, I'm a Christian, I'm a missionary to Muslims, but I'm going to put this Arabic garb on, and I'm going to step in the role of a Muslim, give an evangelistic Muslim presentation, and invite questions from the entire Biola student body. Well, I'm sitting there going, this is going to be interesting. So he launches into his role play. This student comes in the back of the gym not knowing what's going on. In the middle of this presentation, from the top of his lungs, this student shouts out, "This is not the house of Allah. This is the house of the one true living God." Awkward silence. Every time I saw that guy on campus, it was like, yep, there goes that guy. So don't be that guy. Don't be that girl. If someone comes in late, just go, psst, he's just role playing. Second, I'm not saying all atheists believe exactly as I do in character. There's a variety of beliefs among people who describe themselves as atheists. There's secular humanists, there's existentialists, there's Marxists. I have a friend who calls himself the friendly atheist, and I have some friends who are atheists who, well, I wouldn't describe them as the friendly atheist, and everywhere in between. All right? So I'm not pretending that to represent all atheists. Really, the kind of atheist I become depends on how much sleep I get, and I've been getting minimal sleep this week, so you might be in for a treat, all right? So, glasses go on. I'm going to tell you literally 4 or 5 minutes my role play story, which is actually the story of a friend of mine who is an atheist. And I'm going to open it up, and we have, where are you, Devin? We have you're right in front of me. We have 2 mics, and they're going to roam up and down the aisles, and you can ask whatever question, whatever challenge you'd like to raise against an atheist. I'll do my best to respond. That's it. All right? Now I'll give you a chance to come back and forth, but make your questions as concise as possible because there's probably going to be a lot of people who have questions. All right? Fair enough? Ready to rock and roll? Glasses go on. Transforming into an atheist. Here we go. Other one. Oh, there it is. All right. That was a dirty trick. Take the mic away from the atheist. Hey, it's good to be here with you. This is a unique opportunity for me. As an atheist, I often get invited to government events, sometimes secular universities, to debate Christians, but rarely to a church or a Christian university and given a mic. So this is a special, unique opportunity for me. I guess I'll tell you my story. I grew up in a Christian home. I went to church. I read the Bible. I went on mission trips. I prayed. I did all the things I was told to do to be a, quote, good Christian young man. Friends, can I tell you, I believed it, and I practiced it. When I was about 17, 18 years old, probably just slightly younger than some of you are here, I remember having this debate with a friend of mine who wasn't a Christian. We talked theology, we talked politics, and one day, she asked me a few questions I hadn't really thought about before. My first thought was what my pastor always said. My second thought was what my parents told me. My third thought was, well, the Bible says. And then my fourth thought kind of changed things for me. My fourth thought was, you know what? I don't know the answer to that. But I'm going to seek truth and find it wherever it leads. To make a long story short, when I actually began to consider the evidence and read both sides, I realized that there's no good scientific evidence that God exists. There's no reason to think that the Bible is true. There is far too many errors, contradictions, and frankly, immoral teachings like slavery, misogyny, and genocide to come from a holy God. And then as I looked at the evidence for someone who claimed the things that Jesus allegedly claimed, the evidence is really thin. I'm not even sure Jesus existed. And so I became an atheist. It was hard at first because my friends are Christians, my family's Christians. I could see the look in their eyes that I was disappointing them, but I realized I had to follow truth. And over time, it's actually liberating not to embrace these myths that you all, if it wasn't in the Bible, would not believe any of it anyways, and just follow truth and make this life count while I'm here. By the way, just so you know, open-minded. Maybe if I put this in the front here. Grab the mic. Hope it doesn't beep while I'm over here. All right. We'll keep going. Nope, it is dead, isn't it? Want me to use this? And is that better? Okay, all right. We'll use this, and we'll just keep it on. So that'll work. By the way, as I was saying, look, if you could show me that Christianity is true, I would believe it. And if there really was a God who wanted a relationship with me, if there really was a heaven, I don't have a problem with that. I just don't think it's true. I don't find any evidence, any proof that it's actually real. So I'm open-minded. But here's a question for you. If it could be shown that it's more reasonable not to believe in God, would you be willing to change your beliefs if you are a Christian? I think that's a fair question. I was speaking to a group of pastors one time, and I said, I'm open-minded, change my beliefs. Are you? And a pastor goes, nope, the Bible says it, that settles it, I believe it. And I said, wait a minute. So you want me to be open-minded, but you don't have to be open-minded? How can we actually have a conversation if I'm the only one who's expected to be open-minded? So I'll tell you right now, if you could prove to me that Christianity is true, I would believe it. But here's what I've come to discover as I look into it. Maybe this will help. How many of you have studied, or maybe you're studying right now, the ancient Greco-Roman gods? You know these stories, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. Are you familiar with these? Okay, good. Many of you are nodding. So when the ancient Greeks couldn't explain something like earthquakes, what did they say was the cause? The gods are what? Gods are angry. Okay, or they couldn't explain something like rain. What did they say was the cause? The gods are crying? No, gods don't cry. The goddesses were crying. Which would include Thor, by the way. That's not a cheap shot. In the comic books, Thor is the person who wields the hammer, not a particular person. And in the comic books, the hammer is wielded by a woman. Who knew that? Put your hands up. Let me see. Put them up high. Keep them up. Okay, look around at all the nerds. Stepped right into that, didn't you? Says the man with a Superman shirt. See, the ancient Greeks couldn't explain certain phenomena about the natural world, so they inserted God when they lacked knowledge. That's called God of the gaps. But there's a problem when you do that. If you say, oh, here is God where we lack knowledge, as knowledge moves forward and we understand the world, what happens? The room for God gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So you say, oh, God is why the ground shakes. What happens? We understand plate tectonics. You just fill the gap. As science advances, the room for God gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, have we fixed everything? No. But naturalism best explains the world as we actually see it and we experience it. Now, if you want to believe in God because it gives you purpose, it gives you meaning, that's great. I have no problem with that. My problem is when people say it's true as if there's evidence for it, and then they want to force the rest of us to live a certain morality. That's where I say time out, especially if you don't have any evidence. Well, why don't we open it up for some questions? We've got a couple mics, and we have another volunteer who's going to help us out here. If you put your hand up,
don't shoot, I forgot, this is Oklahoma, I'll use a different term. Raise your hand. We will come around and find you. Whatever you'd like to ask an atheist to understand something, a question, a challenge, what would you like to ask an atheist? Shoot your hand up and we'll come find you. Where's the second mic? Is that the one in the back? There we go. All right. Who would like to be first?
Hey, so my question is, you're focusing on, sure, this is to me is what's going to make most sense, but I'm going to go to a different side of like ethics and morality first, just to ask an atheist. So, in your morality, in your ethics, is there such a thing as an objective right and wrong?
Yes, definitely.
Can you explain that for me a little bit?
Yeah, objective is when something exists in the object in the real world as opposed to in just the simple beliefs of the subject. So subjective morality would be relative. Objective morality would be like math. There's a real 2 + 2 that equals 4. That's not opinion. That's the way the world is. History is that way. And I think morality is exactly the same way.
But isn't that basing off of your own description of it? And since you are a finite being, how can you state what is and what is not objective?
Well, just because we're a finite being doesn't mean we can't know all sorts of truths. So I'm a finite being,
truth?
I can know mathematical truths. I'm a finite being, I can know scientific truths. I'm a finite being, I can know historical truths. So why couldn't I know moral truths?
I think truth is a fluid term is what you're using there then. Because you're just saying, well, this is truth, and this is truth, and this is truth, but what about the law of non-contradiction?
I have not said a single thing that contradicts myself. I haven't. If you can point out something free, I'll give you $100 cash right now. I've not contradicted myself. Now, I've used the term truth. There is mathematical truth. There's scientific truth. Because philosophers say the corresponds theory of truth is when a belief matches up with reality. So truth is a term that transcends different categories. There is moral truth, there's scientific truth, there's historical truth. There is no theological truth because there's no evidence for God, but there is moral truth. Why would you have to believe in God to have morality? Especially when your book is filled with slavery and genocide. I mean, you don't actually look to the Bible for your morals, do you?
So, just humor me for a second. If God were to exist, an objective moral lawgiver, then would you agree that that moral lawgiver would have authority all over those things? And so there we can't understand what his mind, so to speak, is thinking of when he gives those moral laws. Like we can't say that we are the same way to judge those moral laws as he was the one to give them.
So I'm not willing to give some hypothetical God a pass on any moral atrocity just because he so-called has authority. If it's completely ridiculous, like we see some things in the Old Testament, then clearly that God cannot exist.
So this is going to sound absurd, but would you say that like eating a baby would be wrong?
This is a Christian school, right?
Yes.
Okay. A baby armadillo? A
baby human, and why? Why would that?
I think it's wrong to eat a baby human.
Why?
I think it's kind of obvious that we would want to treat other people the way that we want them to treat us.
But who
it's the
says
golden
that?
rule.
Where does that come from?
It's empirically wired into us by evolution.
So
it's
something
obvious.
innate in you was designed to believe that way.
No, I don't think it was designed, because that would imply some kind of designer. I think it's the result of natural selection, and without it, we cannot function as beings. You've asked a lot of questions. Let's give someone else a chance. Somebody else who's got a question. We got one up front here. Put them up high, they will come and find you. What would you like to ask an atheist?
Oh, stand up. Okay.
Oh, you're making him stand up?
So, if you think that eating a baby is wrong, then what about the cannibals in other societies? Have they just not evolved as far as you? Or what do you think about that?
Oh, I think they're wrong. People can be wrong, morally speaking. Of course they can. People can be wrong with math. They can be wrong with science. They can be wrong when it comes to morality. That's what it means to have an objective morality, is people know it, but they don't always choose to follow it. Sure, I have no problem saying they're wrong. Maybe I should ask, because we see in the Bible, kill men, women, and infants in 1 Samuel and Joshua. Since that's in the Bible, that seems to be more of a problem for you than it does for me. I mean, if there was war today and they said kill men, women, children, infants, I think every single one of you would say, that's wrong, but you give the Bible a pass. That's part of my problem. I think you should at least be consistent. What would you like to ask an atheist? Now's your chance. We've got one up here. Put them up high and we'll spread the mics out and find you.
I'm not standing up. Okay.
You know what? I missed that. What'd you say?
What do you... I was just not standing up. So what do you believe the objective morality is? And how do you know that you're right?
Well, I think it's objectively wrong to hurt people.
So what qualifies as hurting somebody?
What qualifies? You have emotional hurt. You have physical hurt. You can hurt somebody in a variety of different ways. So since human beings, we have sentience, we have consciousness, we have a conscience. This is not unique. You see morality on a lesser level in other beings, like you see it in dolphins to a degree, you see it in certain primates. It's most developed in human beings. This is uniquely on the level that we experience it, human condition. And so we can reflect upon our lives, reflect upon others, look at what it takes for a society to thrive. And without things like the golden rule, we cannot survive.
Okay.
Yeah, I see a question up there. Put him up in between. He'll come find you. Raise your hands.
So how would an atheist explain the earth coming into being if they don't believe in the Big Bang?
The earth coming into being if we don't believe in the Big Bang?
Yes.
Oh, I do believe in the Big Bang.
But that's not my question.
Okay, I don't understand your question, because you're saying, why would an atheist believe this if they didn't believe in the Big Bang?
No.
Every
How would they
atheist I know
explain-
believes in the Big Bang.
You don't know anybody else?
No, I know a lot of people, but I don't know a single atheist who doesn't believe in the Big Bang, because the Big Bang is scientifically shown to be true to about 7 mathematical digits of precision. There is no doubt about the Big Bang. I mean, do you believe in the Big Bang?
No.
You don't? How many of you don't believe in the Big Bang? Let me see your hands. Wow. Now, you're welcome to not believe in the Big Bang, but realize that puts you at odds with virtually the entire scientific community. This is not an appeal to authority, because the evidence behind the Big Bang is frankly overwhelming. In fact, in the show Universes on the Science Channel about 2 years ago, Alan Guth said, if you don't believe in the Big Bang, you're a scientific crank. That was his words. Because the evidence for it, from the microwave background radiation, from the red shift, from Einstein's special theory of relativity, is overwhelming. So I don't know a single atheist who would deny the findings of science. Why would they? That's the difference between me and a Christian. A Christian goes, I see in the Bible, I can't believe in it, so I won't. I'm like, wait a minute. That's an old, contradictory, false document. Science tells us there's a Big Bang. Why would I reject something so confidently shown to be true? That's how I think about things. Other questions? Yes.
How's it going? So, you obviously believe in the Big Bang and the whole redshift idea and everything like that. So, the redshift talks about the universe is constantly expanding. Would you agree with that? Like
Yes.
constantly expanding outward, yeah. So if you take that back and go to a single point, that would mean it had like an origin, a starting point. And there's a thing in science called like the conservation of energy and that whole thing. So energy is constantly transforming from one point to the next. You never lose energy. So if that's the case, where did the universe start from if nothing could start from nothing pretty much?
Well, we know it didn't come from God. We know that for sure. Because if you say God created the world, you're left with the problem, who made God?
I didn't say that. I was just asking you.
Well, part of how science reasons,
Right.
scientists reason by taking explanations and ruling them down to the most plausible explanation. So we could start with something like God, and you could say, oh, maybe God made it. But that doesn't solve the problem. Who made God? Where did God come from? What caused God? So that's not a plausible explanation. Now, you're right. The law of the conservation of mass applies within our universe. But that assumes this is the only universe. What string theory tells us is there's probably many hundreds of millions or billions, if not an infinite number, of actual universes that exist in the multiverse. And this isn't just like on the Flash TV show if you watch this. This is not science fiction. This is actually one of the best explanations for the world as we know it, that there are other universes outside of ours that we can actually detect.
So I agree with everything that you said pretty much, but my biggest thing is, so scientists themselves cannot prove that there was a Big Bang because we weren't there billions of years ago. All we could do is look at what we have now and make predictions. So has it ever occurred to you that the predictions that scientists make might be wrong despite the most scholarly individuals make those predictions?
Okay, so think about this. You seem to be implying that we can only know something if we're actually there to witness it. If that's the case, we couldn't know anything from history, couldn't know anything from geology. You couldn't trust somebody else's testimony, which is how we know most things. So I don't think the standard of knowing something is whether we were there to view it. By the way, if you're a Christian, then that would rule out evidence for the resurrection, by the way. And I'm guessing if you're a believer, you probably wouldn't want to do that. What we look at is we look at laws that we understand, we look at evidence in the present, we consider different theories and ask which one best explains reality. Now, could we be wrong? Sure. Of course we could be wrong. But that's the difference between theology and science. In theology, you're wedded to an ancient book that teaches the world is flat and has four corners. You're wedded to an ancient book that says the sun rises and the sun sets. So you can't change to fit the facts. You can't do it. In science, we go, oh, we got it wrong. Let's follow it. But with that said, there are certain scientific theories that are so well established. There is as close to zero as possible of these being overturned. And the Big Bang is one of them.
I'll come back to you later. Think about that.
Anybody else? What? You don't have to be, you can be a Christian, atheist. I see a hand over here. What would you like to ask? I see one hand over there. Is there another question? See one up here in the front. Where's my other person with the mic? You got to move fast. Right down in here to save time. I see two on this side. Go ahead.
You said that you were raised in a Christian home, and at 17 you kind of changed your mind. Did you at any point in time believe that God existed?
I did. I totally believed it.
So what happened to make you change your mind?
Well, what happened? What are you fishing for? Like an experience that I had, or what do you mean?
Yeah, you went from believing that there is a God to becoming an atheist, saying, I don't believe that there is a God. But you did at one time, and now you don't.
Okay, so last week somebody said, were you abused by somebody? Was your pastor a hypocrite? Assuming there's some experience, bad experience I had in the church that made me become an atheist. That might happen to some people. To me, it was just intellectual. I remember my friend said to me, she goes, if God is so powerful, and if God is so good, why is there evil? Now stop and think about this. How many of you believe God is all powerful? Let me see your hands. You would say God is all powerful. Okay, put your hands down. How many of you believe God is all good? Let me see your hands. Okay, how many of you believe evil exists? Let me see your hands. So if God is all good, he would want to stop evil. If God is all powerful, he can, and yet evil persists. So either you deny evil like Eastern religions, or you deny God's power, or you deny God's goodness. You can't have all three unless you suspend logic. That was one question that this person asked me. Second, they asked this question. How many of you believe in one God? Let me see your hands. One God. Okay. How many of you believe the Father's God? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe the Father's God? Put your hands up. Okay. How many of you believe the Son, Jesus, is God? How many of you believe the Holy Spirit is God? That's three, friends. You can't say there's one God and there's three gods. You can't. So what happens is my Christian friends will go, well, God has a different logic than yours. And I'd say, really? So to become a Christian, I have to suspend science, I have to suspend morality, and I have to suspend logic? Why would anybody do this? At least that's what I concluded, unless you could give me some evidence. Go ahead.
So just talking about where did evil come from? Or like, how can God be good and evil? Is it possible that evil did not come from God?
Well, not if you read Isaiah when it says God causes evil to happen.
Okay. And then
God.
that was just a question that was in my mind in the last 2 seconds. But what I wanted to talk about when you said, where did God come from? Explain to me a little bit more about what you believe about that in the Big Bang.
Yeah, I don't think God came from anywhere because I don't think God exists.
But you say that he'd have to come from somewhere, because what Ricky was talking about was that there's a central point from which the universe expands, right? Or that.
All I was making the point is if you want to say God is the explanation for the universe, then that's the kind of explanation that stops science from moving forward. So people would say, oh, the ground is shaking, it's God. And then some stubborn secularists said, wait a minute, let's not attribute things to God. Let's go find a natural cause. And they found earthquakes. And then people said, oh, the bubonic plague, it's God who's cursing us. Let's pray and tell him to stop. And then some stubborn secular scientists said, wait a minute, let's actually go research and find out. And they discovered viruses and bacteria and a natural cause. So appealing to God as the cause of the universe actually stops science from moving forward. And besides that, it wouldn't answer the question because you'd still be left with a problem, where did God come from? Is that it? Does that make sense? Okay. Fair enough. All right, over on this side. Whoa.
Okay.
Are you an atheist too? Did they mute you as well? I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I have a few questions.
You go for it. Go ahead. Just go. Start with one. Give me your best one. You got this.
I have a loud voice, so I'm just gonna not use the microphone.
Oh, you got to use the mic.
Okay. Creation has to have a creator. How can you say that a world so perfectly fit together could have just came about by a random explosion?
So a few things. I don't think there was a random explosion. I don't think the universe is so perfect. I think there's a lot of problems in the universe for which it looks more like the result of this cosmic and biological process of evolution. So most of the universe is not habitable for life. Most of it is not designed for human beings. 99.999% of the universe, you would die from radiation, electromagnetism, too much hot heat, too much cold. It doesn't look perfect. But then you look at human beings. Clearly, human beings aren't perfect. Now, probably not that many of you have back pain because you're in maybe your upper teens or 20s. A majority of people have back pain. Why? Because the coccyx in the back, it has certain tail-like structures left over from our ancestors who had tails. No God would have designed where the majority of human beings have constant back pain. You know how many people choke per year? Why would a designer, think about this, why would a designer put your breathing mechanism in the same place you eat? Why would a designer do this? So every year somebody's eating and they choke to death? Like, that makes zero sense. Multiple people die everywhere because their appendix explodes. It's a vestigial leftover from our ancestors for which it performed a different function. So I don't think the world is so perfect. I think it looks more like the result of the naturalistic process that Darwin described.
I just think we have a few glitches, that's all.
Okay, thanks for the question.
Okay, my thing is, you said that we kind of have a God gap. Do you think you use a science gap where you just kind of like, you can't explain something, so it seems to me you're just like, oh, science, like, you can't explain a lot of things. Like, you can't explain why the Big Bang Theory happened. You can't explain, can you explain that for me, right, Coach?
Wait.
Can you explain the Big Bang Theory? We can explain.
Okay, hold on. You first asked if I have a science of the gaps.
Oh, yeah.
And the answer is no.
No.
No, I mean, people will ask, do you have faith? I'm like, no, faith is believing something for which there's no evidence. And in many cases contradicts the evidence. Science is based on reason and evidence, experimentation, hypothesis, proof. Now, do we make hypotheses we have less evidence for sometimes? Sure. That's why we research and keep trying to understand. But if you look at the record of science, think what science has brought us. Communication. We're having this conversation because of science. Transportation. I couldn't be here if it weren't for science, flying through a metal tube in the air. Internet, technology, all this is brought by science. What has religion brought us? War, division,
love,
homophobia. Love doesn't come from religion.
That's what God calls us to do. God is love. God calls for love.
Not if you look in the Bible. I thought he said love your neighbor, and then he says wipe out the Canaanites. How's that loving your neighbor? I mean, honestly, how is that loving your neighbor?
Whatever, when you look at like the Old Covenant, it's different from the New Covenant, because the Old Covenant, the Old Testament ended in a curse, and the New Testament ended with a blessing on the world because of Jesus' death and resurrection.
Jesus said in Mark 2, have you not read? He said in Matthew 19, have you not heard? And he appeals to the Old Testament as if the authority of the Old Testament still applies.
He did not end the authority of the Old Testament, but he did call for more love.
So what did he mean by not a jot or tittle will disappear from the law if he didn't think it still applied? And the law meant the entirety of the Old Testament, the Mosaic law, which included wiping out the Canaanites.
That's fair enough. I don't have an answer for that one. But my second question, actually...
So let me just stop for a second. This is good. If you're willing to probe this, you are on your way to becoming a skeptic. This is what happens. You can only do theological gymnastics for so long. Then at some point you have to embrace reality if you're an honest truth seeker.
At the same time, you cannot really, you're kind of doing the same thing because you were trying to say, oh, well, if God created the world, who created God? Nobody created God. He's an infinite being. If you're using an open mind, assuming that God is real, God is an infinite being. He was there first. He's going to be there last. And then on your topic of good and evil, God is going...
Let's take one at a time. Let's take one at a time.
You have like so many...
Let's take one at a time, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so you said God just exists. He doesn't need a cause. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, if God can exist without a cause, then why can't the universe?
Why can't the universe? Well, I'm not saying it doesn't necessarily. If the Big Bang Theory is true, it exists without a reason. But then there's a lot of things that aren't explained.
Then so does God. So you just asked me to explain the Big Bang, and then you say God doesn't need an explanation, and then you said, but the universe also doesn't need an exption. So I think you answered your own question.
I'm saying that we have an answer, and you guys don't.
No, at best, it would be no different.
No different?
Because we're both saying something exists without a cause.
All right.
At best. I don't buy that, but at best you could say that.
Okay.
God bless you. I heard somebody sneeze. Actually, I hope God doesn't bless you, because I see what happens to people who are blessed in the Bible. Let's go over here.
You mentioned earlier that the universe wasn't perfect, citing that the evidence for that is that our bodies aren't perfect. And if you look at us at a molecular level, we are designed in such a way that all the little pieces just fit right together. And it doesn't make sense for that to have just happened randomly. Like we have, our bodies are just so magnificent that they will fix themselves when they're injured. I mean, I'm sorry. My question is, how do you explain that? How would you say that we would come to be?
Okay, so first off, I don't think the DNA processes are perfect. Every time your DNA is copied, there's about 100 errors.
Right.
Every single time, which is why we have conditions like sickle cell anemia, a painful disease for people with a slight change in the DNA. Why would God do that?
Well, they're not, because we're not imperfect. I'm sorry, we're not perfect, but if we were, we would be gods. We would be immortal.
I don't know about that. You can have a perfect phone book. Actually, that's a bad example. You guys know what a phone book is, right?
We would never
just
die. Just
because something's perfect, it doesn't mean it's God. Perfect is necessary to be God, but it's not sufficient.
No, but if our bodies were designed absolutely perfectly, we would never die. And that would be miserable living for, millions of years.
Is your life that bad? You don't want to live?
Well, I don't think that I would want to live that long. I mean, it would be kind of bad after
okay.
a while.
I think you would have to prove that there's a difference between your body being perfect and looking at the bodies we have. And at the beginning, you said it's genetically perfect. There are a lot of genetic diseases I could describe in detail that would probably make some of you weep.
Okay, but what
That happened to children. You asked about eating babies earlier. Why would your God make DNA and make babies that are born in utter pain, can never have human touch, die so easily? If this God can make it not that way, why wouldn't God do it? But if you look at evolution and things are cobbled together through this slow process, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Good questions. Let me we're running out of time. Let me take just a couple more. Go ahead.
This room is huge.
And they're all looking at you.
Isn't that cool? If being open-minded, if the resurrection of Jesus Christ were historically proven true, would your open mind be open to Christianity?
Sure.
So on the different lines of evidence, can you refute the lines of evidence such as the disciples dying for the resurrection?
Yeah, here's your answer. Not a single one of them died.
No?
As a martyr. They all died. I'm not even sure the disciples really existed. I think they were made up. Can you give me a single piece of evidence in the first 500 years of the church?
Josephus.
For what?
That Jesus rose from the dead.
No. You're not. I'm not talking about Jesus rise from the grave. Josephus did not mention that, by the way. That's a separate issue. That any of the apostles died as martyrs.
No, sir, not outside of tradition, unless someone else.
Let me save the time. There's no evidence. It comes from Fox's Book of Martyrs in the 1500s. And Christians just embrace it. There's no evidence Peter was crucified upside down, Paul that was beheaded, Bartholomew skinned alive. These are myths that are made up, centuries removed from the events themselves.
And the Gospels themselves?
What's that?
And the Gospels themselves, the historical documents that surround the resurrection?
Well, the Gospels don't mention anything about the fates of the apostles. Nothing is mentioned.
What about the resurrection itself?
Well, the Gospels are late. They're contradictory. They're filled with mistakes. There's textual problems, the way they've been copying from one generation to the next. They're filled with so-called miracles that you would reject in any other document. If you heard them in the Book of Mormon, you'd reject them, but you accept them in the Bible. Historically speaking, yes, the Gospels talk about the resurrection, but we have no reason to take them as reliable documents. And by the way, I'd further ask, which Gospels are you talking about? Are you excluding the Gospel of Judas? Are you excluding the Gospel of Thomas? Are you excluding the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Truth?
Yes, sir, the pseudepigraphal documents don't count.
That's really convenient.
It is really convenient because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only ones that are consistent.
So they're actually not consistent across each other.
That takes a long time to debate.
What's that?
That takes a long time to debate.
No, it's simple. They're not. Look at the tomb. Mark says there's one young man. You get to Matthew, there's two angels.
At least one?
They're not consistent. One's a young man, two are angels. One says they went to the tomb when it was light. The other one says it was dark. One mentions a guard, one doesn't. One mentions raising of the dead in Matthew 28. The others don't mention that. I mean, you just read. This is what I did when I was a skeptic. I started to read the Bible closely and critically. Rather than assuming it's God's word, read it as a critical historical document. You'll be amazed at the errors.
If they all mentioned the same things, there would be no reason to have four Gospels. They all, you mentioned the passing them on from one generation to the next. How can we know basically what all of the Gospels say based on manuscripts that were preserved, number one, and number two, quotes from early church fathers by which we can rebuild them?
Okay, so slow down. Manuscripts that are preserved, you're talking 4th, 5th century manuscripts, 400 years removed.
So do you
just stop and think about that? 400 years removed.
Have you read?
And in those manuscripts, we find errors and differences across them. You're just assuming that the Bible reports what was originally written down. There's no evidence for that.
Have you read Homer's writings, sir?
Uh-huh.
you have, we can reasonably kind of assert that they're generally pretty darn close to what they were.
So let me just jump to the chase. Let's assume that Homer's passed accurately and that applies the same to the New Testament.
No, sir. Because the earliest manuscripts that we have of Homer's Odyssey we can date within 1,000 years. In the
That's actually false, just so you know.
It is, sir?
It's false.
It is.
It is false. It's about 500 years.
Oh, 500.
It's half that. But listen,
compared to the Gospels,
here's the point, then we got to take somebody else. Even if it was more accurate than Homer's Iliad, most would say Homer's Iliad is one of the top copied books from antiquity. Okay? It still doesn't mean it's true. You don't think that stories he tells in the Iliad and the Odyssey are true. It has nothing to do with truth because it's an inventive narrative, and the same is true with the Gospels. Let's go to the top. Last question, better be good. All right, and then we'll go over here. They really have a question.
My first one's not really a question. It's more of a statement. And then I have questions.
Got to be quick.
So going back to the Big Bang, I want to quote just a random apologist that I know. And he said, "I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it." I don't know if you know the guy. I've heard that. But
so first off, quotes from random apologists mean nothing to me.
I know. You may
Unnamed, no source. So are you saying you disagree with all the rest of your classmates who don't believe in the Big Bang? Christians can't even agree about the Big Bang? I mean, what's your point?
I just had to say that. It wasn't a question. It's all right. Okay, my question, or I guess my answer to one of the things you said about multiverse theory. Multiverse theory only works when you are able to understand where it first originated. So you could say, this multiverse exists, but how did it exist?
What's your proof for that? I don't know a single scientist who would embrace that. What's your proof for that claim?
How can you explain the existence of the other?
No, you just made a claim about the multiverse that contradicts everything we know. I want to know your source and how you know that.
I'm asking a question. Do you know how they existed?
Okay, time out. You make an assertion, and then when I ask you to defend your assertion before it comes to me, you just kind of punt and don't answer it. That's not how the way conversations at least should operate. So if you're going to say there has to be an initial cause for the multiverse, what's your cause for that? What's your explanation for that?
Well, it's only rational, since you said that there's, in the beginning of even the Big Bang, as you would say, that there has to be a cause for the Big Bang. It can't just exist.
I never said that. She said God can just exist, so I think the multiverse can just exist.
Okay, well, I'll just pass it on.
All right, last question, up top.
Hi, so you talked about how you believe in Darwinism. Is that true? Like, you believe in Darwinism?
Darwinism.
Sorry, Darwinism. I've learned about the Cambrian explosion. Have you heard of that?
I have.
How do you explain, then, the fossil records if you believe that we just evolved, if the fossils don't show evolution?
Well, they do show evolution. Do we have every fossil? No. The Cambrian explosion is a period of 80 million years. 80 million years. The term explosion, I think, is very deceptive because you think it's like instant. The time frame is about 80 million years. So that's a ton of time for the evolutionary change that would be required for the different phyla that appear in that period. But second, we actually do have multiple Precambrian precursors to the Cambrian era. So it's a flourishing of a lot of animal life during the Cambrian explosion, but it's not qualitatively as distinct as I think the way you're implying that it is. In fact, interestingly enough, Alistair McGrath, if you want to quote Christian apologists, in his book Fine Tuning, says there's an increase in oxygen during that rate, sped up the evolutionary rate, the mutation rate, so we see an increase in mutations during that time. And he's a Christian apologist. I think he at least got that one right.
There's several different theories that can be correct, but another thing that I'd like to bring up is you've read the Bible, so you know that our fall from God and Adam and Eve. So I believe that's why we are imperfect. That and also God gives us choices and decisions because God lets us decide for ourselves, like you've decided not to believe in Him. So I believe that's why we're imperfect.
You're welcome to believe that. What I would ask as a skeptic is, can you give me any evidence whatsoever for the historical Adam outside of the Bible? And the answer is, not only is there no evidence for it, there's good evidence against it. I have a book in my bag by a Christian theologian who says because of genetics that we know, the earliest society, because the amount of genetic variety that we have over the past 200,000 years, it could not possibly have happened from a couple, from two people. Mitochondrial Eve. It couldn't have, let alone 10,000 years or 12,000 years. The first colony had to be about 10,000 people. It couldn't have been historical Adam and Eve. So, number one, I don't hear any evidence Adam existed. And even Christian theologians are like, well, we kind of need to go back and change the Bible because there's no evidence for Adam and Eve. So if you gave me evidence for that, I'd believe it. I just don't see any proof.
I just don't.
Let's give this guy a question in the middle, and we'll end there. He looks really amped. This is it.
I thought this would be a good one to end it on, but do you know Jesus loves you?
Now, I live in Southern California. Are you talking about Jesus? Because there's a lot of people named Jesus. That's a popular name in Mexico. Do you mean Jesus? Can you give me evidence Jesus actually existed? Then I would believe it. Can you? You think Jesus loves me? Can you give me evidence Jesus is real? All right, atheist is gone. That was a good one to end on. Good question, by the way. Nice job. All right, so how you guys doing now after this conversation? Doing all right? Here's what I want you. I want you to actually write something down. You ready? I know some of you are writing a report for this. Write this down, include it in your report. I want you to take a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, and write down how well and prepared you were to articulate and defend your faith. 10 would be nailed it, 1 would be I got steamrolled, 5 would be average. Whether you asked a question or not, how prepared were you sitting there thinking, okay, I understand this. I at least have a good reason for this. I know why I believe what I believe, and I can at least ask a thoughtful question and articulate my beliefs. Actually write a number down, because when you go to your groups and write this in, this will be there for reflection, okay? Write a number down. Put it down between a scale of 1 and 10, because 1 Peter 3:15 says, sanctify Christ as Lord, always be ready with an answer, and give it with gentleness and with respect. Write down a number. Second, I have a question for you. I'm curious. How do you guys think you treated me as an atheist? I'm curious. What do you think? Individual words. I'm curious. I have no agenda other than what you think. Give me individual words that you think describe how you treated or interacted with the atheist. Frustration? Okay, you were frustrated? So I heard cordial, I heard mean. It's always interesting to get how different people interpret the same thing. You felt frustrated, and you didn't think as a whole responded lovingly and respectfully to me. Is that your take? But that's your take. That's what was going on, and you're pointing to this guy. No, I'm just kidding. She didn't call anyone out. Okay, fair enough. Other thoughts? Jude, what do you think? That was very well stated. So, you hear what she said? She said, there comes a point where you ask so many questions and it's like, just stump the atheist versus help me understand what you believe, even with tough questions, still love you as a human being. Was that fair? roughly what you said? Okay. Very well stated. Did you go to Biola? I'm just kidding. Very well stated. Other thoughts from the interaction? Because we could jump in and we could start wrestling with, what about the Canaanites? What about the origin of the universe? What about the morality? But I want to take a minute and pause and ask, first off, what was going on in your heart when we were doing this? And second, yes, I was role-playing. How do you think you interacted with me, and how do you interact with people of different belief systems? Because it can become, like you said, didn't it? It can become stump the atheist, win the argument, prove somebody wrong. But then we fail to ask the question, how do I love somebody? How do you love somebody? Now as an undergrad, I majored in communications. And they would talk about two key things. They'd say there's the truth of what you believe, and there's the medium by which you communicate it. There's the content, and there's the relationship. Jesus came in what? Grace and truth. Jesus came in grace and he came in truth. See, I think people make two mistakes today. Either they just speak truth without any love, just speak truth, call it like it is, without loving people. But then there's people who say, I just want the sake of a relationship, fail to speak truth. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, he says, speak the truth in love. It's both. So I do teach in the university, but I also teach an undergrad. I'm sorry, not an undergrad. I still teach 2 high school classes at a local Christian school because I love hanging out with 9th through 12th graders. And I got tired of seeing my students graduate, go into the university, and have their faith picked apart by a secular professor or by their friends. So I got together with a friend of mine, Brett Kunkel. I know you guys know him, and he was taking these trips. I said, you need to help me take our high school students to the most godless, secular place we can think of. We'll bring in atheists, agnostics, let them speak to our students, but I'll teach my students how to interact lovingly with people of very different worldview. So this past year, we took 29 high school students to Berkeley. We brought in atheists, we brought in agnostics. Now, why would I do that? Are you ready? I think there's one reason why you should be a Christian. When it's all said and done, there's one reason. Are you ready? Because Christianity is actually true. If it's not true, don't believe it. Even Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus is not risen, your faith is in vain. So you asked about the resurrection. That's a good line of questioning. If the resurrection is true, Christianity is true. If the resurrection is false, by Paul's own criteria, you should be pitied and your life is in vain. You might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I think you should be a Christian because Christianity is true. But you know what else I think? I bring high school students, and I brought in some famous atheists. You might even recognize their names. Put them in front of high school students. We had a few junior high students. Why? Because I think Christianity can actually hold its own in the arena of ideas. It can hold its own. But the question is, are we going to learn it? Are you going to know it? And then when you know it, are you going to be able to articulate it thoughtfully? So I'll tell you this. These are some of the best questions I've got in a long time doing this. I think that would encourage you. And the spirit here, some of you got a little testy, and I was pushing your buttons. I was pushing things out there. Probably as a whole, the kindest group I maybe have ever done this with. That's a good sign. You should feel good about that. The rest of you should, okay? Let me tell you some times that I've done this. I've had people stand up and yell at me. I've done this, so you know, in youth groups of 12 and in stadiums of 6,000 people. Tens of thousands of Christians, pastors, youth pastors. I had a guy stand up and yell at me. I had a guy stand up and threaten me. I was like, you know I'm role-playing, right? I wish you were sitting there. I would have felt a lot better. I'm like, you want to threaten me? There's my man Abdu. He's got my back. Because this guy was rather big compared to me. I'm like, I'm role-playing. I was at a youth group in Texas, just south of here. And I started off a whole week, I taught 10 or 12 times. And at the very beginning, I kicked it off with my atheist role play. And these students were testy, they were angry, they were defensive, they had no idea what they believed. Finally, this girl in the back middle, she stands up, she goes, "Mister, I want to read you something." I said, "Okay, what are you going to read me?" She said, "It's from the Bible, the holy word of God." I said, "You know, I'm an atheist. I don't believe the Bible." She goes, "I don't care. Listen up." I was like, okay. She reads to me Psalms 14:1. "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." I said, "So you're publicly calling me a fool?" She goes, "Yes, mister, you're a fool." A bunch of her friends stand up and like, "Woohoo, got you." They're giving each other five. They're like, "Ha ha, fool," and they sit down. All right? I like it. It doesn't bother me. So when it's done, like, students surrounded me because they were thinking, "Gosh, how would you answer this question? What is the truth about this?" This girl waited till everybody was gone that night, probably an hour or an hour plus. She was going to be a junior in high school, so about 17. She goes, "I want to thank you for doing your best to defend atheism." I said, "Sure, why are you thanking me?" She goes, "Well, I'm an atheist." I said, "Really, you're here at a Christian camp? That's fantastic. How'd you get here?" She goes, "Well, I am a leader in my youth group." I said, "I feel like I'm missing something." She goes, "I've grown up in the church. I've been in the youth group. Recently, I had really tough questions, the kind that we just interacted on." She said, "I couldn't find answers. My pastor couldn't answer. My youth pastor couldn't answer. My parents said, just have faith. And eventually, I realized I don't believe anymore." I said, "Well, have you told anyone?" She said, "No, you're the first person I've told." I said, "Why haven't you told anyone?" She said, "Because I'm afraid they'll treat me like they just treated you." I'll never forget that. I don't think we realize as a whole as Christians, the jokes we laugh at, the stories we tell, the attitude we so often have towards whatever group you want to talk about, whatever that group is, whether it's the atheists, the secular humanists, the LGBT community. Sometimes we are not motivated by love, but by winning an argument, winning a political battle, proving that somebody is wrong. I did this at a stadium of 6,000 students in Minnesota, right? They're supposed to be nice in Minnesota. Minnesota nice. I turned around to start, and this group of students go, "Boo, boo, go home, Mr. Atheist." And one youth pastor shouts out, "You're going to hell." Like, he shouts that at me. And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. Here, I'm your guest. I'm asked to speak as an atheist. Do you think Jesus would do that? I mean, he said, love your enemies. He was a friend of sinners. In fact, Paul said, if you speak in tongues and words of prophecy but don't have love, you have nothing." I mean, I laid into these students, 6,000 students in the stadium, and it was silent, which proves there's a God because junior hires were present. The next summer, I was speaking to about 500 students in Salt Lake City. I turned around to start, and this group of students clapped. They go, "We love you, Mr. Atheist." And that kind of caught me off guard. That doesn't happen. So I went to him afterwards and said, "Why did you say you love the atheist?" And the guy goes, "Well, we were part of the group that booed you in Minnesota." You know what I realized? They got the point. Friends, we can't compromise truth. That's what I love about you. That's what I love about this institute. You're not going to back down. You're going to speak truth at this institution. We need voices of truth today, but we have to be motivated by love. We need both. In fact, it says in Romans, it's your kindness that leads to repentance. So I wrote a book called "Is God Just a Human Invention?" with a pastor friend of mine, responding to almost all the arguments that came up. We talk about the Big Bang. By the way, I saw that you were quoting my friend Frank Turek, by the way. Questions of evolution, questions of morality, almost all the questions you ask, we deal with in this. And I was having Christians read it and give response. I thought, I don't just want Christians to read this. Like, I'd love to have some real conversations with skeptics and see what they think. So I found the largest free-thinking atheist group in Southern California where I live. Called the guy up. I said, "Hey, my name's Josh McDowell. I've written this book." He knew who I was because he had seen me debate on a public campus shortly before that with another atheist on God and morality. And I said, "Hey, I've got an idea for you. I wrote this book. I'd be happy to bring a box of free books. I'll sign them, just give them away, and I'll come sit on the hot seat at your group, and you can ask me whatever questions you'd like to ask a Christian for a couple hours." Now, I don't know about you, but that actually sounds like fun to me. And it's not because I think I have all the answers. I'm well aware that there's plenty of smarter people in the world at least those three in the front row for sure. I don't even pretend to have all the answers. I'm well aware that I don't, but that wasn't my goal. So I went to this group as my wife and my pastor, the three of us. It was in this home. Now, it wasn't a church, but they had fellowship before. They had coffee and donuts. They had announcements, and they passed around a hat to collect money. Just interesting observation. Just call it like I see it. Well, on the group, they asked me questions for an hour and a half, really interesting questions. At the end, I said, could I ask you some questions? And I could have asked them, how do you get objective morality without God? And by the way, I thought your line of reasoning at the top was one of the most powerful lines of reasoning with a non-believer. Romans chapter 2 says, people even without the law know right and wrong because it's written where? It's written on their hearts. It's written on their hearts. Everybody knows there's a right and wrong. And people who say they won't, in a matter of time, will contradict themselves. I think that's a great line of reasoning logically, but experientially. There's a moral law, and you know it. I could have asked him about the origin of the universe. By the way, I do believe in the Big Bang, and I think Frank Turek is right. If there's a Big Bang, there has to be a Big Banger. Now, the Big Bang is often used as a naturalistic explanation to explain the world without God. But if by the Big Bang we simply mean that the universe had a beginning, that sounds a lot like Genesis 1. I could have asked him all these other questions, but instead I said, look, I'm a Christian, and I think Christianity is true. I said, what bad impressions do Christians leave for which we don't even get a hearing from skeptics and non-believers? And I remember a lady, she was sitting right in the front, like I could have reached out and touched her. She was right there. She's probably 70 years old. She said, listen. I said, what do you mean? She said, all my Christian friends want to preach at me, tell me why I'm wrong. Sometimes they tell me I'm going to hell, but they don't want to listen to my worldview and my questions. If they don't listen to me, why should I listen to them? Then a guy in the back who's maybe 50 or 55 said he used to be a Christian, now has a website trying to debunk Christianity. He goes, stop the atheist jokes. I thought, man, dang it, I've got some good ones. Actually, the word he used, he said, stop slandering atheists. Now, that's a pretty strong charge, isn't it? I said, sir, what do you mean slandering atheists? He goes, look, I used to be a Christian. I'm an atheist. He goes, occasionally I will just go to a church and observe and watch. Now, stop and think about it. If you're not a Christian, church is a really interesting and weird sociological phenomena. It is, and it should be. Weird means out of this world. I mean, we were at church the other day singing about the blood. I'm thinking if anybody comes in and doesn't know Christian theology, this is weird, right? He goes, I'll come and I'll just sit in and I'll watch. And he goes, every time I go, I hear some cheap shot about atheists or some other non-Christian group. And I'm sitting there thinking, this guy's over the top. Like, come on, he's got a complex. I'm telling you, within a couple weeks, I'm sitting in church with my wife who's there that night. And the pastor told a joke at the expense of atheists. And my first thought was, number one, I hope there's actually no atheists here. And number two, he's right. I think we do this more than we realize. I just want you to reflect upon this in your heart. Because yes, I assumed a position. I'm not saying all atheists are this way. But I assumed a position. I was biting towards you. I was disrespectful, trying to elicit a certain response from you. What was really going on in your heart? Were you sitting there going, I'm going to prove this guy wrong. Can't believe he doesn't know this. I'm going to win the argument. Or was it, wait a minute. There's people who really believe you can get morality without God. There's people who really reject that the Bible is God's word. And what that means, Jesus said, if you don't know truth, you cannot be set free. Friends, you know what this entire institute and today is about? Hopefully for you, and there's probably some of you this way, we can't change that. There's probably some of you like, I just got to do this, write notes and take it down. Fine. That's not why we're here, though. We're here because Jesus Christ has called us to such a time as this. And if you want to make a difference in your generation and in your age, friends, you have to know and be willing to speak truth. But you have to do it not from a position, I'm going to win arguments, prove people wrong, but from a position of a broken heart. That this world we live in is profoundly deceived, profoundly mistaken. And the only truth that can set people in this world free is a living relationship with Jesus Christ, who came in grace and loved people, but he spoke truth. If you do that, I really believe God is going to use you in your family, in your life, in your generation to make a difference. Amen? Let me stop for a second with everybody here and just say, are there one or two questions? We have a breakout session coming up where we're going to wrestle with these questions, and you'll have a chance to ask Joe, Abdu, and myself. But are there any specific questions before we break for me, or something that came up that's just bugging you that I could make sense of? Any of them? Any that, because I don't want you to come to an apologetics day like this and become an atheist. Number one, I'd never get invited back, and that'd be counterproductive. And by the way, I don't believe almost anything I said with my atheist glasses on, just so you know. Any questions for me? Or something that came up that's bugging you, like, wait a minute, how would you make sense of this? Anybody, or even the way the dynamic went? Yeah. Hi. I really enjoyed it, actually. Hold it right up there. Yeah, I guess it's still off. Check 1, 2, 3, 4.
Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. If you were in our situation and there was actually an atheist on the stage taking questions from the audience, how would you respond? What would you ask?
That's a great question. So let me tell you a very interesting story. Today's Friday, right? This past Sunday, I was at a church, and I was doing this atheist role play, about 300 people. 10 minutes into it, an atheist walks the front. I didn't know he's an atheist. He picks up the mic and he goes, hey, can I ask a question? I'm an atheist. I said, sure. He goes, so you're role playing an atheist. I'll role play a Christian, and I'll ask you what I think a Christian should ask. I thought, sure, this is really interesting. So he asked the question, something like, how do you find meaning and connection when there's no God? I thought that was a really interesting question for an atheist to answer. So I answer as an atheist to a guy who really was an atheist. And then he sits down. And then when I was done, we had about 15 minutes at the end. I know the pastor decently, not super well, but I thought I'm going to take a risk. So I called him. I said, hey, we got 15 minutes left. You had enough courage to come up here and ask a question and call yourself as an atheist. Would you come on stage and just allow me to interview you and ask you your story? And he said, yes. And I could see the audience, everybody's like, whoa, this is kind of interesting, right? And I didn't try to prove him wrong. I didn't try to debate him. Because the purpose of this, I have the mic, and I was manipulating the conversation, right? I hope you don't walk away from this and go, I got to read 50 books, and I got to go debate atheists. That's not the point. I was trying to elicit a certain emotion and challenge you to see whether you can defend it or not. In my experience, the most effective way is just to have a conversation with people. Listen to atheists. Ask their stories. Ask them tough questions. So I think if I was up, questions I would have asked, I would have said, so in that setting, which is different than here, here's what I said. I said, so you're an atheist. Tell me your story. How did you become an atheist? Did you ever believe in God? Tell me your story. I said, I'm sure you've thought about this. Who do you think Jesus really is? And then I said, what would it take for you to become a Christian? What would it take for you to believe? I said, what's your perception of how Christians treat you and how they ask? And I asked that because I want them to be in a position of like, we value your opinion. We want to learn from you. We want to listen. We care about you. And then I threw in a couple like, so, science and faith. How do you explain things like the origin of the universe as an atheist? So I asked him that, but we had built some relational capital. It wasn't like, gotcha. And then what was awesome at the very end, like the church just surrounded him and was like, in a loving way, hey, you're always welcome here. Got his contact information and just followed up relationally with him. And I thought, this is golden. So I don't lead with like gotcha questions. I really think you've got to ask the tough questions. But I really believe just loving people, listening to people. I mean, if I really was an atheist in front of 800 people, like 1 on 700, right? I tell my students when we actually bring atheists in, I'll say, you can ask the toughest questions that you can think of. Ask them, but do it lovingly. Don't do it in a gotcha way. Do it in a genuine way you would want somebody to ask you a question. That's it. So does that help? Does that make sense a little bit?
I had one follow-up.
Sure.
So when I'm in this situation again and there's an atheist up front, the dynamics of this group, I think, were favoring you pretty heavily, in my opinion. Would it be worthwhile to speak up and ask questions?
Sure.
Okay.
It's always great to ask questions. I tell my students, especially I have a lot of high school students who will go to a secular university and they'll have atheist professors, and I'll say, ask questions. I'll say, sit in front, be the best student, show respect. I mean, when you're on stage and you're teaching, you know exactly who's listening and who's not. I know looking at the audience, it's fine. If you want to ask a good question, be respected, sit in the front and ask good questions. Now, if someone throws the burden of proof back on you, if you're asking questions, I would just simply say, actually, I'm just here to learn. I didn't put anything forward. I just want to know, what do you think about this? And that's it. And then if you had a chance, I would follow up with that person in person and go, I don't know, are you willing to have a conversation about this? Would you be willing to get coffee? And it's amazing. Sometimes somebody's persona on stage versus in real life, defenses and the guard goes down, and you can have a real conversation with somebody. So I actually think I'll end with this. I think there's people can be atheists and not believe in God for a variety of reasons. It can be intellectual. I'm convinced for most people it's not intellectual. It's moral. I had someone tell me flat out, I think Jesus is God, you've convinced me, but I'm not going to give up sleeping with my girlfriend. I mean, flat out told me that. I've never had someone be so honest. He goes, I won't give up sleeping with my girlfriend and believe in that. Are you kidding me? I was like, and he actually said, even if it damns my soul to hell. I mean, flat out, I was like, wow, you might be the most honest person I know. Next to Trump. I don't know Trump, just for the record. So there can be moral reasons. There was a massive study by Paul Vitz, and he said, of the great atheists in history, one thing they found in common was a dead, distant, or harsh father. These issues up here, if I can, I want to find out what's the heart of the issue. So I've had an atheist say, what about Canaanites? And I'll simply say, that's a great question. And I threw that on a lot because I know you're addressing it. So good luck, by the way. I'm just kidding. I said, if I could answer that, would that help you be one step closer to trust Christ? I'll answer these questions. I want to get to the heart of the issue and know what it really is, if I can. And through the power of the Holy Spirit, loving people, if we have an answer, it's amazing how often God will use you in somebody's life.